Good morning and welcome to the BDO Back to Business series. This webinar that BDO has put together is made up of 6 modules over the next 6 weeks, so starting Thursday mornings. We aim to bring to you some ideas for you to think about your business as you work through COVID level 3 and then hopefully shortly thereafter to 2 and back to 1. Recognising that BDO acts for a wide variety of clients in many sectors and industries, we're keeping this webinar series pretty much at a general topic line, but give you the opportunity to ask questions after and then follow up with your partners. The 6 series webinars are going to cover today, meeting the challenges of Alert Level 3 and beyond, followed by then taxation, looking at the various taxation tools, subsidies and methods the IRD have given to your businesses. We will then look at a series on resetting strategies. While you might have some very long-term strategies, here at BDO we are strongly suggesting that you have a short-term level 3, level 2 and out to year-end short-term strategy. We will then look at some restructuring options. Our corporate recovery guys would like to talk about if your business needs to focus on restructuring, what some of those options available to you are. Then we'll be covering a digital strategy, thinking about if you haven't got in your toolbox thoughts and minds around a digital strategy and what's appropriate. We've got some ideas for you to think about. And then finally, the 6th series is looking at your financial reporting statements. And to remember, even through this difficult time, revenue recognition, impairment of assets, onerous leases, restructuring, going concern, COVID-19 considerations all need to report and reflect back on your financial statements. We are then looking to run some further topics and we welcome your suggestions on what you would like us to cover in following episodes. So today, Tarunesh from our Auckland office, Head of Risk Advisory, is going to lead us through the meeting the challenges of Alert 3. Tarunesh.
Thanks, Dave. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome, everyone. I'd just like to start by echoing David's comments there and thank you all for tuning in today. It's great that we've got over 200 people registered and online. Hopefully you all get something useful out of the session this morning and you'll join us again over the next few weeks for following episodes that we have coming up. As David mentioned, I lead BDO's risk advisory practice based in Auckland. Risk advisory tends to be one of the less understood areas of the firm. The work that we do is quite varied, but it all focuses on strategy, risk and compliance. Simply put, we help clients to develop their business strategies and to identify and understand the risks that stand between them and achieving those strategies. Further down the track, we also provide support with reviewing and redesigning processes and ways of working. And we can also provide assurance to management and the board that things are working in the way that they expect them to. In terms of the session this morning, the purpose is to provide you with a simple overview of the Alert Level 3 rules that are most pertinent to businesses and their employees. The alert level system, particularly Level 3, is new to us all, and while there's a growing amount of guidance available, this isn't always easy to find or follow. What I've tried to do is synthesize the key points into a handful of slides. We'll briefly touch on the rules as they relate to personal movement, then discuss the key operating rules relevant to businesses, including COVID-19 safety plans. And we'll wrap up by discussing a few key points to consider as you move through Level 3 and over the short to medium term. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. Now, as I mentioned, this is our first session. I can assure you that a huge amount of prep and testing has been done, but after all, we are accountants, not filmmakers and producers. So if we do encounter any issues, please bear with us and we'll get them sorted out as quickly as possible. If you have any questions or comments throughout the session, can I encourage you to post them in the Q&A panel? We're keen to get as much interaction as possible, and you can access the panel by using the Q&A button, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. What we'll do is have the presentation, which should last about 25 to 30 minutes. And thereafter, David and I will run through a selection of the questions that you've asked and provide our thoughts. The webinar is being recorded and will be available with the presentation slides on our website over the next few days. So with all that out of the way, I'll move on to a few of the prepared slides. Showing, just move forward, thank you. Right, travel and personal movement. I'm sure this is an area that we're all generally across, particularly as there hasn't been much change between level 4 and level 3. But given the impact on consumer patterns, businesses and employees, we thought it'd be a good idea to do a quick recap now. As a general summary, the rules still impose a significant limitation on movement and travel. Generally, we must stay within our region, although there are some exceptions for anyone performing essential work or services. In terms of what's permitted, you can travel to go to work or school, and that's for those who have to, although if it's possible to work from home, employees are still required to do so. And while schools do slowly open up over the course of this week for students up to year 10, the attendance is voluntary, and attendance numbers are expected to be reasonably low, at least over the next few weeks, as parents opt to keep their kids at home for a bit longer. You're able to travel to access permitted local services and businesses. These are effectively those essential businesses that were able to operate under level 4, and then any business that's able to operate safely under level 3 and in accordance with the guidelines. You're able to travel to perform low-risk exercise and other recreational activities in your local area, and to visit people in your extended bubble. The last permitted travel is to permitted gatherings, and these are funerals and wedding ceremonies, which, as a side point, can each only have a maximum of 10 people in attendance. In terms of use of vehicles, this is just a quick note for those of you who operate a fleet or provide vehicles for staff use. While it is relevant to all of us personally as well, that's the reason I mention it now. Most expired certifications, warrants, licenses, endorsements, etc. have all been deemed to be current by the Transport Agency. This is for all documents that expired after 1 January 2020. No new expiry dates have been set, with the Transport Agency stating that this will be done as soon as we return to normal business. A couple of key points to note here: there's no exception in relation to road user charges. This operates as normal. And the Transport Agency has also stressed that all vehicles must still be safe to operate regardless of warrant of fitness status. There's a greater onus now on owners to ensure that routine maintenance checks are being performed regularly and that evidence of these checks is retained. In terms of public transport, this will remain operational throughout level 3 and looks much the same as it did in level 4. Its use is essentially aligned with permitted personal movement that I just mentioned, and will be subject to physical distancing and public health measures. Services will be limited though, and safety measures will significantly restrict capacity. Something to keep in mind of if your employees rely heavily on public transport. In terms of domestic air travel, this remains heavily restricted. There's really not much change between the levels. Business air travel is still limited to essential work only. There are 3 differences under level 3. You're now able to fly if you were stuck in the wrong place when the lockdown began and you now need to travel home. You need to attend a funeral. Interestingly, you're not able to use air travel to attend a wedding. And you're able to use it if you are relocating a home or business. Based on current guidance, it looks like air travel will only resume in a form that we're used to under level 2. In terms of freight, just a quick mention here, all channels are open and cross-border movement is permitted, although capacity is likely to be constrained as logistics businesses continue to work through backlogs and may still be hindered by COVID measures of other countries. Next slide there, please, Charlene. In terms of businesses, right, these are the business rules. These have been built around a handful of workplace controls that are at the center of the government's COVID strategy. They are supporting people with flu-like symptoms to self-isolate, ensure separation distances are maintained, disinfect surfaces, maintain good hygiene, particularly hand hygiene and cough and sneeze etiquette, and keep adequate records to facilitate contact tracing if required. As I run through the rules now, you'll see that one of those 5 points underpins each matter. There are 2 key objectives behind the framework: to keep workers safe and to limit physical interaction with customers. That's at the core of how you need to operate under level 3. Businesses must self-assess their ability to meet the restrictions and operate safely. Government agencies will not determine if individual businesses can operate, nor will they keep a register of businesses that meet the guidelines. For those businesses that were able to operate under level 4, there's fundamentally no change to the way in which they are required to work under level 3. Everything remains the same there. You cannot operate if your business involves close personal contact or physical contact, for example, hairdressers, domestic cleaners, massage therapists, and gyms. You must develop and implement a COVID-19 safety plan. This is a fundamental requirement under the level 3 rules. It's enforced by WorkSafe and is bundled together with directors' existing health and safety duties. The following slide deals with this in more detail. You must maintain good hygiene measures, including physical distancing. This is 2 meters when in public and 1 meter between people when in controlled environments such as the workplace. Staff must work from home if they're able to. The guidance is quite clear on this requirement. It's not a suggestion. For example, if technically possible to work from home, but perhaps it's a bit inconvenient or less productive for workers, they still must continue to work from home and should not return to the workplace. Only supermarkets, dairies, petrol stations, pharmacies, and permitted health services can have customers on premises. All other businesses must operate in a contactless way. This includes orders, payments, and delivery with absolutely no physical contact with customers or the public at any stage through that process. I'm sure we've all seen that this worked to varying degrees across the hospitality sector over the last few days. In terms of PPE, the guidance is clear that PPE is only necessary now if it was necessary pre-COVID-19. With that said, it's important to be mindful of perception, both in relation to staff and customers. Many employees will expect their employers to provide them with PPE, even as our active case numbers track back down towards 0. Next slide, please, Charlene. I mentioned the COVID-19 safety plan on the previous slide. This is an absolute core component of the level 3 requirement for businesses. Under alert level 3, all businesses that are permitted to operate must have a COVID-19 safety plan in place. Before work begins, you need to develop said plan and outline how you will ensure that your people are working safely. You also need to discuss and share the plan with everyone at work, including your team, contractors, suppliers, etc., before work can actually recommence. This is one of the key requirements that seems to be seems to have disparate understanding across sectors and industries. There are a lot of people who are well aware of it, but even from the people I've spoken to and clients that I've talked to over the last week or so, there seem to be many who weren't aware of the requirement at all. You should review and update your plan regularly. While this is something that has been implemented as a level 3 measure, it's also likely to be something that remains through the remaining levels and is ultimately going to be rolled into existing health and safety requirements. You should develop your plan by focusing on 7 key considerations. It should be a record of how you'll address each point. These are: consider whether any risks that have arisen as a result of the level 4 lockdown have crept up. Outline what these are and how you'll manage them. For example, this is where, for instance, machinery that requires maintenance due to a lengthy shutdown, or the impact of reduced staff numbers, or for example, new agency staff that require critical training. This is essentially all about identifying what risks have now crept up purely as a result of the 4-week lengthy shutdown imposed by level 4. Point 2, consider how you'll ensure that workers know how and are able to keep themselves safe from exposure of COVID-19. This is all about communication and training of staff, and will mean they're able to maintain good work and hygiene practices in line with your plan. Don't assume that workers will just know how to do this, and make sure that they have or know where to get the correct official information that you and relevant health authorities have put out. Consider how you'll gather information about the wellness of your workers to ensure that they're actually safe and able to work. This is absolutely vital. Workers who are unwell or suffering symptoms consistent with COVID-19 must not come into contact with other workers and must not enter the workplace. If workers do have these symptoms, they shouldn't come back to work until they have either recovered or have been tested and cleared of having COVID-19. We've seen businesses deploy different techniques here. For example, self-assessment checks prior to each shift, i.e. a series of simple questions about how they're feeling before that need to be answered by the employee before they actually enter the workplace each day. Or another measure that we've seen work is temperature checks using temperature thermometer guns. Point 4, consider how you'll operate your business in a way that workers and others will remain safe from exposure to COVID-19. This obviously is the absolute crux of the plan, and something that we'll cover in a bit more detail on the following slide. Consider how you'll manage an exposure or suspected exposure to COVID-19. Things such as responsibilities, isolation, leave policies, public health reporting, contact tracing information are all absolutely key here. Effectively, you need to know what to do, when to do it, and where the information you need to do that is. Consider how you'll evaluate and continuously review whether your work processes or risk controls are effective. Plan or policy, this should be reviewed and adjusted where necessary, even if it's only in place for a period of time. The last point is to consider the impact of any changes that you make to the ways in which you work. This is all about, well, I'll give you an example. A simple example, if you were ordinarily controlling the risk of heavy lifting by having 2 people to lift every heavy item within your warehouse or operation, now because of physical distancing, you'll only be able to have 1 person to do that work. How will you now address that particular risk now that it's changed as a result of the measures that you've put in place as part of your COVID-19 plan? A useful template, safety plan template, is available on the WorkSafe website. The template is a series of things to consider, and it provides a simple route for you to actually develop your plan, but the guidance is far more helpful. I'd certainly direct you to that on the WorkSafe website. Next slide, please, Charlene. Operating safely. So as I mentioned, how you'll operate in a safe way is one of the 7 points that you must consider when developing your safety plan, and it's fundamental and the crux of the document. To ensure that your approach is robust and comprehensive, there are 8 questions that you ought to consider when developing your plan. These are: which workers will need to come into the workplace and why? How will physical distancing be achieved, and where is it necessary across your business? What process will be in place for cleaning surfaces, including supply of equipment and consumables? So this is not just about who will perform these tasks, but how will you ensure that you have access and a steady supply of the equipment and consumables for cleaning that you require? What processes and practice have been introduced to enable good hygiene, in particular hand hygiene and cough and sneeze etiquette? Again, also consider the supply of equipment and consumables necessary here. How will you work with other businesses or people who you interact with to ensure appropriate practices are followed by both their workers and yours? This is a key component, and it does help you meet your Health and Safety Act overlapping duties, responsibilities. How will you inform and, if necessary, train workers on new processes, including how you check that workers have understood the training and know what they need to do? When, if at all, PPE will be used and why? If PPE is to be used, how will workers be trained to use it correctly, particularly removal and when to replace PPE equipment? And the last question is, how will you engage with your remote workers to ensure that they have the right equipment and support to work safely and maintain their well-being? Next slide, please, Charlene. As we all continue to grapple with the effects of COVID-19, these are 5 key takeaways that we pulled together for you to consider as you take your business forward through level 3 and through the rest of 2020. Some may be front of mind, others may be less obvious, but just as important. It's important to keep in mind here that these are just some of the key things that we pulled together and suggest you focus on over the short to medium term. It's not by any means a comprehensive list, and as David mentioned at the start of this presentation, everyone has a different business with different nuances, sizes, sectors, regions, etc. Your list may look slightly different to this, but these are some of the key points that are most relevant to most businesses. There are also key points that we're seeing a lot of our clients contact us and discuss. They're things that are on the top of their minds and things that they're dealing with now that the initial shock to the system, if you will, of the level 4 lockdown coming into place and the impact of that, cash flow measures, etc. Now that all of those have by and large been dealt with, or at least are being managed, these are some of the things that our clients are now turning their attention to. Review your strategy. This might seem obvious, but it's an area that people often overlook and use excuses such as, I don't have time, or things are changing too fast at the moment. It makes no point to actually look at our strategy now. The way in which we live and the way in which we do business has fundamentally changed over the past few months. A lot of that change is temporary, but will become permanent. Or at least some of it will. We need to be sure to identify those lasting shifts and adjust accordingly and pivot where possible. This is also a key measure to survival for a lot of businesses. As David mentioned, this shouldn't, at this stage anyway, be a long-term exercise. We're not talking here about 5-year plans, 2025 plans. This is really about how are you going to get through the next month, through level 3, however long that might last, then through to say 3 months from today and a little bit further on, but not too much through to the end of this year. When you're doing this, remember to consider your risks and also update your risk management framework accordingly. Second point down, develop, implement and communicate your COVID-19 safety plan. As I mentioned, this is absolutely critical and is a core requirement of the level 3 framework. I'd be surprised if this isn't actually a requirement that persists through level 2, or at least in a slightly different form. And ultimately, it will become something that is rolled into the wider health and safety requirements imposed on directors and businesses. It's all the more important to get it right now. This is also an area that the government's paying close attention to. I'm sure you will have all seen the media over the last couple of days. and the government checks that are being carried out on businesses operating under level 3, and whether they're actually have a robust plan in place, and then B, whether they're actually adhering to those plans. There's obviously been a huge amount of media in relation to physical distancing breaches. I think on day one there were over 100 breaches, and including 21 prosecutions. Most of these relate to inadequate distancing measures, but interestingly, most of the businesses that were heavily reprimanded were those where physical distancing wasn't being adhered to by customers or would-be customers outside of their premises and in public spaces, all about queuing, etc. Third point, establish robust contact tracing measures and ensure that they're working. This is a key requirement laid on businesses, the ability and need to keep adequate records that allow contact tracing should that be necessary. There's a lot of talk about GPS-enabled apps and similar technology uses, but there are very few that are actually available and ready for use today. A lot of businesses are opting for a paper solution. The issue that you do need to keep in mind when it comes to electronic solutions is privacy and security. Who's holding the data, who has access to it, and how secure is any data that you input ultimately. At BDO, we've actually opted for an electronic solution, but an in-house solution that's been developed by our IT team. They show me that it's not particularly difficult at all. Our system is essentially a simple app interface that all of our staff and suppliers have access to. When, for example, a staff member has to enter one of our premises to, for example, collect some files or equipment, they jump into the app, put their details in, who they are, etc., and the time and date of when they access the building, and that then automatically populates through to a SharePoint list that's held on our servers and is secure. It's hopefully data that we never need to use, but it does exist, it's secure, and it's easy for people to record when they need to. In terms of compliance obligations, it's more important than ever to make sure you don't overlook these. Given everything that we're dealing with, it's easy to overlook compliance obligations like AML requirements, for example, if they're relevant to your business. Something that's perhaps pervasive, but not absolutely front of mind all day, every day. Another area worth looking into, and this is something where we're having quite a few conversations with a lot of our clients, is around the wage subsidy. So we have, over the past 5 or so weeks, helped numerous clients apply for and obtain the wage subsidy. But now that we are out of level 4, where we're starting to resume normal operations and getting back to business, it's really important that people go back, look at the assumptions that they made when putting those applications in, and actually identify whether they were accurate or whether things have moved on significantly, and ultimately whether they are still entitled to receive and pass on the wage subsidy to their employees. This is something that's absolutely key, and also a good time to just look through and identify any staff movements that have happened over the period since you started receiving the wage subsidy, and what effect that actually has on whether or not you need to repay some of that money back to the government. And the last point there, review your forecasts. It may seem like one of those ones that's incredibly obvious, but again, putting these in place, they're really, it's a business fundamental. It should really have been put in place and been operational throughout, but we've seen a lot of people reforecast and put more detailed, granular information together at the start of level 4. Now's a chance, again, when businesses start operating again and things change a bit, time to reforecast and look at how you're looking on the revenue front and cash flow front 1, 3, 6 months out, and keep a really close eye on that and reforecast regularly. Particularly important if you've had to obtain additional funding. Now that we have a bit more certainty about what operation looks like and when you can get back to quote unquote normal operation, you've got a better idea of whether there are any shortfalls coming just on the horizon, or perhaps whether you're actually carrying too much cash or have access to a facility that's larger than you actually might need, resulting in facility fees that you don't necessarily need to be incurring. David, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to any of these points.
Thanks, Tarunesh. There's a couple of things I'd just add, and it's all around directors' responsibilities. The organisations that are going to police the work safety and your COVID-19 work safe plan are most probably struggling just as much as we are to actually police that. You've got work safety, you've got the police, you've got the Ministry of Health, you've got MIMBI, almost probably looking at your organisation. But more importantly, you've got the public out there. Self-policing seems to be rife at the moment, with the public dobbing in organisations who they deem aren't adhering to a work safe plan. Just this morning, I heard on the radio an organisation that had been spotted by the public where earmuffs were being shared amongst the workforce. And clearly, a work safe plan hadn't addressed for that organisation the need to have separate earmuffs. It's those sorts of things that actually, from a director's responsibility, are your responsibility in that work safe plan. So while you might think that you're up and running and are getting back to work, take a stop and think that there are people out there who are most probably looking at your organisation and the way you conduct yourself more than has ever occurred in the past. The other one, and touching on Tarunesh's point about the wage and salary subsidies that people have applied for, is the 30th of April today, the end of the month, and arguably this was the first month if you had claimed that you were demonstrating that you were 30% revenue or more down. And so I think as people have this week moved into level 3, restarted their businesses, starting to earn income, it is part of that obligation to stop and have a look at that forecast that you provided yourself and your board or your senior management to look at and make that claim. And there is that onus on you to reset and have a look and ensure that your requirement criteria to which you set about claiming is still valid. We are already seeing organisations being prosecuted. There are a workforce, 104 people the government have set about to audit claims. You are seeing organisations, 29 have already refunded their wage and salary subsidy. And as I said, some actions are being taken. And finally, that point that Tarunesh raised, reviewing your forecasts, it is the responsibility, I think, of directors to not just look at a forecast that remains out to the end of the year, but literally weekly review those, so that because this is a moving feast, this environment is changing significantly. So you should be resetting and reviewing your forecasts as new information or new circumstances come to mind. Tarunesh, back to you.
Thanks, David. Very good points. And yeah, something that everyone needs to consider and just be mindful of as they move into that, well, at least the next couple of weeks in level 3, and then let's see what happens with the decision the government's going to take on the 11th, whether we're extended or not, and then further into the levels as we hopefully quickly track downward back to well, level 1 and ultimately no level at all. We'll turn our attention now to some questions that you've all asked over the last half hour or so. We may not get to cover off everyone's questions here and now today, but what I can assure you is that we will take a note of all of them, and we will be sure to get back to you with our comments or thoughts over the next few days. just looking through some of the questions that Jamie's feeding through to me now. We've got a question here from Kathy, who asks, do staff need to keep a log of their movements outside of work that are not directly related to their employment? The short answer here is no. The responsibility here for contract tracing is on businesses and in relation to you as an employer and you as a business operating. You need to have a clear record of who's come into contact with your people and who they've come into contact with in a business sense or business setting, and then be able, should, for example, someone within your organization become sick with COVID-19, that will then allow tracing of who has been in contact with that person, both internally and externally for work purposes, to enable contacting of those relevant people so that they can get the testing and information that they require. But in your personal capacity or your employee's personal capacity, there's no requirement for them to keep a trace of that. However, you know, as good practice, if you could, if it's manageable, it's probably not a terrible idea. But you know, for example, I'm personally not keeping a record of who I come in contact with outside of the home in a personal sense. But theoretically speaking, you really shouldn't. If every business is operating in accordance with the requirements, you shouldn't really have too much contact with anyone. Only exception might be public transport that I can think of. Hope that answers that. Bear with me while I just look through a couple of these others. We've had someone here just ask the question about what is an AML requirement. Very quickly here, I'm just referring, when I spoke about that, to anti-money laundering requirements and the Anti-Money Laundering and Countering Financing of Terrorism Act. This is something that's relevant to some businesses across the economy, certainly not all. For example, accounting firms and lawyers, as well as financial institutions such as banks, are required to comply with a series of requirements within that act. That's all I was referring to there. The particular point in relation to AML, I appreciate it's probably not relevant to a lot of businesses, but the key thing to note here with alert level 4 and alert level 3, one of the primary requirements of the Act is for people to perform customer due diligence and confirm the identity of their customers, which is usually, or at least very frequently, done in person. The ability to actually do this now that we're not able to meet people face to face and be in contact or direct contact with people, it means that a lot of people aren't able to do that. The sector supervisors, the agencies who administer the Act, have come out, such as the FMA, and stated that for now, while we are subject to the alert level system, it's acceptable for people to obtain all the information that they require as part of CDD and then perform the actual verification component of that identity at a later date when they're able to do so. So yeah, hope that answers that off.
Tarunesh, I'll just jump in here.
Sure.
There's a question, and there's quite a few questions around the wage and salary subsidy, and next week's tax session will cover off quite a few of those, because some of the questions become quite technical from a tax perspective. But one that I just picked up was the question around an employee who leaves in that 12-week period, to which you've had a wage and salary subsidy paid. Remembering you've done a calculation on the number of employees, you've made that calculation that your revenue is 30% down, and you have an obligation, as the government has said, to pay that out over those 12 weeks. And therefore, if an employee leaves within that period, you obviously won't be paying that subsidy out anymore to that particular person. You will definitely have an obligation to refund that portion of the wage and salary subsidy that they no longer won't be getting because they've left. Another question there was around, Tarunesh, the app that we have designed in-house. And as this person pointed out, while that was a very proactive step by us, we're of a size and we have an IT team that can actually do that. But understanding that many businesses that we act for don't have the resources, are of a size that they can't actually have an IT team that can spend some time designing an app. And the question is, should they be waiting for a government initiative or programs to come out? The question is just how quickly tools come out for people to use. And in the absence of anything, you will have to go back to just manual track and trace. You need to demonstrate now you're under level 3, and if you are working and your staff are on site, coming into contact with clients, customers, or going out on the road, in the absence of any technology, you need to physically, manually keep a record of where you're going, who you're seeing, what time, exactly the sorts of things that an app, an electronic IT system would do, you need to do manually. Back to you, Tarunesh.
Thanks, David. That's a really good point. And I have actually just picked up that question and was going to, well, echo what you just said. We're in level 3 now, and while an electronic solution would be ideal if there were easily accessible and solid options available to everyone now today, but in the absence of that, it will need to be a manual exercise with forms and spreadsheets, because we are under the requirements now. The ability to produce contact tracing information today already exists. So I certainly wouldn't be waiting, and I'd be putting in what was feasible now today. I think we're just waiting for a few more questions to come in. Please do, if you have any questions or if there's anything on your mind, please do pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll look to address them. As David mentioned, a few comments in there around the wage subsidy. We'll certainly take note of those. If it's not a point that David's just addressed, we'll certainly get back to you via email after this session and put you in touch with the right people and the right information. But again, as he mentioned, there is quite a lot of information about the wage subsidy and also other government measures that are in place on our website, in our COVID-19 microsite. The details have just flicked up onto the screen there for you. Please do visit that and have a look. We've got a huge amount of frequently asked questions in relation to the wage subsidy scheme, the business finance guarantee scheme, and all sorts of other measures that are in place, as well as just performing business and running your business in light of COVID-19. So there's a huge amount of information there. Please do have a look.
Just want to pick up another question there, Tarunesh, and that's around the use of vehicles and FBT. Now, I'm not a tax partner, but I think I can answer this one. So a company advised all its staff while they were in lockdown level 3 not to use their vehicles at all, and that they should be using their own personal vehicles for household trips. Though in this case they had a couple of staff that did need to use their cars during that level 3, and should they and were going to pay FBT, they said that was the approach. Do I agree? And yes, that would be the right approach. I mean, I think the IRD would be expecting, while everyone was in a level 4 and you weren't an essential service, and that you had advised all your staff not to use their cars because you're not physically being able to do work, they would expect that for that period, 4 weeks, there would not be an FBT liability paid. And it would be then your own self-policing, where a staff member used it, advised you that they'd use their vehicle for personal use, that you would pay the FBT on that. So that seems a very logical, common sense approach, and I do agree with that.
Thanks, David. We've got another question here as well, which asks us just to to outline exactly what the process is for paying the subsidy, the wage subsidy this is, onto employees, and that this particular person's received differing advice. Just value your thoughts on this. They're specifically asking, in a situation where someone has worked minimal hours during level 4 or 3, what's the requirement to pass the subsidy on to that person, as well as where they have not worked at all. My understanding is that if the subsidy is claimed and received in respect of an individual, an employee, then that amount, the $585.80 per week for a full-time employee, needs to be passed on to them in its entirety, and that any additional amounts over and above that may have been agreed between yourself and the employee, it is then the difference that needs to be paid on. Is that your understanding, Dave?
Yes, it is, and it would be, because it's 12 weeks, it would be paid each week over that period. So my background is audit, and we're obviously auditing companies. If you had that payment received before 31st of March, then naturally you won't be taking that all into your income. You'll be spreading that over the 12 weeks, and that's the accounting rules, and that would be the same as the tax rules. The IRD have actually said that you wouldn't be declaring that all up front as income. You'd be spreading that over the 12 weeks. And that's logical also, because if in that period an employee, like the question earlier, left or who was no longer in your employment for whatever reason, you wouldn't be paying out that subsidy at all. So you're amortizing it over the 12 weeks, sorry.
Thanks, David. Another question here in terms of whether you have had to have actually suffered the 30% decline in revenue due to COVID over a 1-month period, or whether it can be a longer period than that. The test here is on a month-on-month, or rather, if you've seen a 30% decline in a single calendar month between January of this year and June of this year, when compared to the same calendar month in 2019. So it does need to be that 1-month period, a 1-month acid test that they're looking for here. And as we said in the previous slide, something to be very aware of and to keep a very close eye on is to actually now, if you claimed the subsidy on a projection that your April numbers were going to be, say, 50% down, what's reality actually panned out as? And did you actually see that decline in reality? Because there may be implications on whether you need to then adjust the payment and make some sort of repayment back. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, just want to pick up on that too for you, Tarunesh. Again, with my audit hat on, there's a great term called in the audit world called teaming and lading, and I think as these auditors go out, set from the government, the 104 people that have been tasked to look at the wage and salary, they will be looking at the particular month that you have claimed and saying that your revenue is down. They would be then looking at the next month following to ensure that actually you haven't held off orders simply to show a revenue drop of 30%, but actually the next month is out of the ordinary because you've shifted income across. So I think that onus is on you to go back and very much review your claim, and the again, that self-police, and if you're returning that subsidy, which a number of organisations have, would be the right approach. I don't think from a risk perspective you'd want to wait until the external auditors from the government come and actually review your claim.
Thanks, Dave. And touched on that in my a predicted drop in revenue, triggering the eligibility, and then actually you hadn't seen a 30% or more decline. whether you were required to repay the subsidy. And the comment here is that, on the assumption that the forecast was prepared in good faith. The reality and the guidance certainly that I've seen being put out by both BDO and also a few other organisations is that in that scenario, you do need to contact MSD to arrange repayment of any wage subsidy that was received, because that is certainly, as David's just outlined, the same audit process and asset test that the government's auditors would be looking for should you be audited. And I think in these scenarios, while you may not in reality, we all have to operate on the assumption that you will be audited. The government certainly put a lot of time and resource behind their audit team going after businesses to ensure that the scheme's actually being used for the right purposes and that people are eligible.
Couple of very good questions here, getting into the technical aspects about the wage and salary. You've made a claim, an employee left, but you've re-employed a new person or employed a new person. Does the wage and salary apply to that new person? Now, I don't know the answer to that question, and I think some of these, because they're getting into very much a technical aspect, tax. We'll come back to you on that, assuming we've got your details by email. We'll email you the answer to that. Otherwise, we'll definitely pick that up at next week's taxation review of those tax reforms where Ian Craig is going to speak. Just bearing in mind, this topic today was generally about going back to work, level 3, obligations, responsibilities, what you need to do and how to set up your business and frame yourself ready for level 3 and then back to level 2. And I do understand and appreciate that wage and salary subsidy is a significant issue for many of you because you've received big dollops of money. The obligation for you then to hold to account that, record it, disclose it for tax, etc. And then the movement of staff does create quite a few queries for you. So we'll round back out on that, come back with answers, and ensure also that Ian picks that up next week for you.
Agreed, David. Thank you. I will go out on a bit of a limb here, though, in one of those questions, because I have an answer, having spoken to one of our advisory partners yesterday. Someone's asked, is the amount of the subsidy to be taxed? And again, I'm only relaying the words of one of our tax experts here, but the receipt of the wage subsidy is non-deductible, or rather the payment out is non-deductible for the business itself and non-assessable for the employee. And on receipt of the lump sum payment into the business, there's no GST on that receipt as well. I don't think we want to cut.
So I just want to cover off a couple of things that I'd like you as an audience to start thinking about. So I touched on, again, the 6 topics, the challenges of coming back to level 3 today, taxation next week, and then resetting strategies, looking at short-term interim strategies, restructuring options, digital strategy, and then your financial reporting obligations. Some of the things that people may want us to cover off and we're thinking about in further sessions, so put your minds to this possibly and give us some feedback, is looking at how do you start to create a sustainable business, how your business practices of today, pre-COVID-19, can't really go forward under this new environment. We're not out of the woods in terms of the possibility of another pandemic ever, and we don't yet have obviously a vaccine. So how do you actually create for yourself, worst case we went back into level 4 sometime or another pandemic occurred, how do you create a sustainable or a more sustainable business? Another topic, your corporate social responsibility. Actually, as an organisation, stakeholders, both internal and external, may have an expectation of you and your business stepping up and having a greater corporate social responsibility. I'd like Tarunesh to cover off on risk management, actually for those organisations that had not actually considered the risks of their business. Maybe now is the right time. The thought around collaboration, clustering, business models and hubs. The way you operate going forward will need to be different, and readopting old ways won't be acceptable. We'd like to hold a session specifically for the not-for-profits. That is a sector that is going to be hugely hit through the outcome other side of COVID-19. That sector relies so heavily on the generosity, the goodwill of organisations and people, and we suspect that sector is going to need particular help. Therefore, collaboration, clustering may be a very applicable way to operate going forward, outsourcing. So very much welcome your suggestions and thoughts. I'll hand back to Tarunesh now. There's only a few minutes left, so it's enough for me. Thanks very much for your participation today and your queries and jumping on board, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Back to you, Tarunesh. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Yeah, look, thank you. I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone for tuning in today. Really appreciate your engagement and your attendance or virtual attendance to this first session. Hopefully we were able to give you a clear understanding of the boundaries that you need to operate within in relation to level 3 and moving beyond that as well. In terms, well, you've got a slide there in front of you. You've got my contact details. As I mentioned, for those of you who we haven't been able to answer your question or we haven't been able to get to that in the allotted time, we will be in touch and we'll either provide you with a response and an answer to that question, or we'll put you in touch with the right person across our business who can help you and sort that out for you. If you would like to get in contact with me and discuss anything about the session today, please feel free. My email is on the screen now. I did refer to our BDO microsite in relation to COVID-19. You've got the web address there, but if you simply go to our BDO website, the first banner you see at the top of the page will be a link to that microsite, and there's a huge assortment of information and frequently asked questions about all matters relating to COVID-19 there. Please do have a look. And just a quick note, David's touched on this already, but the next session next week, please join us at 9 AM next Thursday for a session on taxation and COVID-19 tax reforms, and there'll be a lot more information and detail about things like the wage subsidy in that session held by Ian Craig, our National Head of Tax. Lastly, just a quick thank you to Charlene and Jamie behind the scenes for making sure that all the wheels keep turning. Really appreciate your efforts and arranging everything here. Other than that, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone, and we look forward to engaging with you next week at episode 2. Thank you very much.